Welcome to our audience. Welcome to the Newberry Library's continuing series of virtual public programs. My name is Brad Hunt. I'm the Vice President for Academic Research and Academic Programs here at the Newberry. And today we'll be hearing from Erik Gellman, who has a new book out called Troublemakers, Chicago Freedom Struggles Through the Lens of Art Shay, recently published by the University of Chicago Press. The book uses photography of Art Shay to argue for new understandings of American protest movements in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, especially in Chicago. Erik Gellman is professor of history at the University of North Carolina, and he's written two books before this one, Death Blow to Jim Crow, The National Negro Congress and the Rise of Militant Civil Rights, and also The Gospel of the Working Class, Labor's Southern Prophets in New Deal America, co-authored with Jared Roll. I've had the great fortune of knowing Erik for a long time. He and I were both colleagues at Roosevelt University for about a decade, and before that, we had worked at the Newberry Library on the Encyclopedia of Chicago in the late 1990s, a long time ago. Thanks for doing this conversation. Thanks, my friend. And especially under the circumstances. Yeah. And, you know, if your 3-year-old daughter decides to march through the screen, that's great. You know, she might steal the show. That's just fine.
I've got a couple cats here who are coming in and out as well, but hopefully no one minds that.
Yes. To our audience, thank you for joining us. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type out a question, and we'll do our best to answer them. Though we're going to have about 45 minutes, we may not be able to get to everything. Erik, why don't you share your screen, and I'll start with our first question.
Great. Okay.
So let's start by talking about the collaboration between you and Art Shay. How did this book come about? How did you decide that this was going to become Troublemakers, a book?
Well, that's a long story, but I'll tell a shorter version. So I had heard of Art Shay by his great reputation around Chicago as a photographer who took amazing photographs of celebrities like Marlon Brando. And I knew that he had photographs of him and Nelson Algren wandering around the streets of Chicago as well. I didn't know the true extent of Art Shay, though, until I actually met him. And the reason I got a chance to meet him was, of course, through Roosevelt University, a place both of us worked, and it's such a special place, and it was a connection of a connection. And so I ended up having lunch with Mike Ensdorf, the head of the Gage Gallery of Roosevelt, as well as Art Shay and his wonderful assistant Erica DeGlopper. And it was in that lunch that Art and Erica told me about hundreds of thousands of Chicago street photographs that Art had taken from the moment he arrived in Chicago in the late 1940s, all the way up through the late 1960s and beyond, that had never really been published or emphasized. And that really intrigued me. That led to Erica and Art opening up his Deerfield home to me. And it's just this incredible archive that I was able to dig through. And, Art tolerated me digging through his home archive, and Erica was essential because Art's office in the 90s was voted by Office Computing magazine of the messiest office in America. So you can imagine, without Erica, the state of things there, I never would have been able to find anything. And so I sorted through and looked through hundreds of thousands of unpublished photographs that hadn't seen the light of day for decades. And that became an interesting exhibition by the same name as the book at Roosevelt. And then after doing the exhibition, I tried to expand it into a book project. And so the collaboration continued, as well as the number of photographs I could use. Beyond the exhibition itself, Art Shay and his assistant Erica threatened Time, Life, and other publications And as a result, many, many new negatives and rolls of film were coming back from these publications because Art Shay had always been a freelance photographer. Therefore, these other publications didn't own the rights to his photographs. So it was like an incredible array of photos. And every time Erica told me about more and more photos coming back from Time Life, I thought, oh, great. But then I also thought, oh my God, more photos, right? It's such a rich archive. So that ended up being the book project, where the history part of the project, I was able to expand that with all kinds of new archival research, using the great historiography of the history of urban Chicago that you're a part of, and so many other people that are probably on this webinar are a part of, to write a new synthesis, but also a new interpretation of post-war Chicago urban history.
So who do we have here on the screen?
This is Art Shay. So
Yeah.
I thought the first slide would have to be Art. And the picture with the other gentleman in the pool hall is him with Nelson Algren. And chapter 2 of the book specifically looks at their relationship and collaboration in the late 40s and early 50s. And so it's from that era. And then the other picture is a little bit later. That's Art Shay at the Democratic National Convention in 1968 with the gas mask on. And I chose that picture because I think, given our current context, it's something we could all relate to.
Yeah, so this book is much more than, the typical book on photography. A guy like Art Shay would be a little introductory essay and hundreds of photographs, or as many as you can afford to print. So, but you've really tackled this very differently. So tell us about how you have used the photographs to tell a new story about urban history.
Sure.
And other histories.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing about this book is early on, and fortunately Tim Minnell at University of Chicago Press really agreed with me, that Art Shay's life is totally fascinating. But this wouldn't be a book about Art Shay, but rather this is a book about using Art Shay's wonderful canon, an incredible span of photography, to merge it with history. Just a couple of quick things though about Art Shay before I move on. Just a couple quick things to know about him. One is that he grew up in the Depression in the Bronx. There were periods in the 30s where he was making more money as a kind of aspiring photographer than his father, who was, traveling into the city looking for day work in the garment trades. And then he volunteered to fight in World War II and ended up flying a number of missions as a navigator there, and saw a lot of death and horrible things during the war. He volunteered for the war because he believed strongly in anti-fascism. And then when he came back from the war, he actually worked for Life magazine for a couple of years, but he really couldn't stand working for someone else. And so he became a new kind of photographer. And in fact, in the early publications where he talks about it, they spell the word freelancer as 2 words. He became a freelancer photographer, which is, selling his work to a variety of publications. Just about every major publication Art Shay sold his work to at various points. But this allowed him an incredible amount of freedom. I mean, in some ways it was, economically insecure to be able to do this, because you always had to hustle up work in the next story. But in other ways, he never had to just go and get the shot. He wandered around the streets of Chicago. He went into all the neighborhoods and alleys and all the places other photographers didn't go. And so as a result, Art Shay is kind of a remarkable photographer in what he's left behind, because part of it is photojournalism, but part of it is art, and part of it is him being intellectually curious. And so you have this wonderful archive to work from. And so then what do I do with this archive, right? And so the idea here is to make a book that's half history and half photography, where one speaks to the other. As you said, there's lots of books that have lots of huge pictures and captions. And then there are a lot of history books, and I was guilty of this too in some of my earlier work, where you write the book and then you just throw in a few illustrative pictures. You don't talk about them, you don't analyze them as primary sources, etc. And so this book was an attempt to merge the two. And, you know, I didn't have a lot of models to use, and the ones I did find were kind of daunting, right? If you think about Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, or The Sweet Flypaper of Life with Langston Hughes, right? I can't write like Richard Wright or Langston Hughes in these kind of hybrid photography projects, but I could bring a historian's eye and bring important context to these photographs.
So let's see some more pictures. Show us some of what you've selected for us today.
Sure.
Sorry, I sound like a kid in a candy store.
So I picked out just a few representative samples to talk about. This one, you know, is an example of something that really surprised me. It was finding these photographs that really led me back into the archives to think about the early Cold War period in Chicago and how it impacted protest politics and machine politics. It never occurred to me that housewives from Winnetka were troublemakers in the early 1960s. And here you see a picture from the early 60s of Women's Strike for Peace, an organization that sort of linked housewives, but also Shirley Lenz, the famous Chicago socialist, was the head of the Chicago chapter. So it was like socialists and housewives in this organization protesting against nuclear war and the Cold War. And, you know, they had a lot to protest against. The other pictures that I chose, you know, that really shocked me, on the top, you see an amphibious landing practice from the early 1950s, and they're doing a military exercise where they're about to land on Montrose Beach. And I'm sure all of our Chicago participants can relate to where that is in Chicago on the north side. And then also you have Nike missiles right along the lakeshore in Chicago too. You know, so that's one example of the kind of photography that led me to analyze this and then go back to the archive and try to figure out what this was and how it informs a new kind of history. This is a more familiar scene, but this is Trumbull Park housing project and the infamous harassment of a few African Americans who moved in there in the 1950s. I just love this photograph. I mean, there's so much going on here to analyze in terms of, at first it kind of looks like a rosy campfire scene, but then you realize that it's police sitting around the fire and they're protecting the young African-American couple that had moved in to the projects up above in the window. This ran in Life magazine in the fall of 1953 as a full-page color photograph. And it led me to think, you know, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about Trumbull Park. I had read your book. I had read Arnold Hirsch's great book. But maybe I should go back to the archives and look more into this. And, you know, I went to the American Friends Service Committee archives in Philadelphia that hadn't really been used, and some other archives, to try to tell a different story, to try to understand, you know, what was the mentality of the police? What was the mentality of the residents in the housing project and then in the surrounding neighborhood? And of course, all that research ends up as just a page or two in the book, but, you know, it's just wonderful photography that opens up my curiosity to do more research.
Yeah, for our viewers, can we go back to the Trumbull Park for a second? This is 1953 racial integration at a handful of African American families in an all-white housing project. How do you do that? The only way to do it is to have police around the clock. And I'd never seen this image. And I'd read that, oh, police were there around the clock. I thought, well, what does that mean? Well, this tells you what that means. They're sitting around a fire for large chunks of the night. But what does that say to the residents in the building? That there's this fire, that they need police protection. The police are a little ambivalent about this, likely. Yeah, wow. That was a real confrontation in the city about integration. And eventually, the black families are a handful are allowed to stay, but the city's not going to embrace integration in the 1950s.
Right, exactly. And, you know, the people who moved in to desegregate this housing project ended up being prisoners in their own apartments, right? They were the ones who had to go around with armed guards around them to get into the police paddy wagons to go just to the grocery store. You know, whereas the other people who were actually engaging in violence and other behavior were able to roam around the neighborhood free. So just one more example, of sort of how this photography led to new ideas. I had already been at work on a book about the late 1960s in Chicago and done a lot of research on it. And when I saw this photograph in Art Shay's archive, I got really excited because I had long tried to argue that we need to understand the history of gangs to understand the complete picture of the urban history of Chicago. And here's Art Shay talking his way into a ride-along with the Blackstone Rangers in 1969. And of course, the gangs actually, for a short period in the late 60s, became sort of allies to the Black Power movement and to civil rights activities, in particular the challenge to the institutional racism in the construction trades. So, I mean, what a remarkable picture. And, it led me to be able to embrace a much wider lens in terms of thinking about social protest in the city of Chicago outside of narrow boundaries like, civil rights over here, labor movement over there, gangs nowhere, or, if you're talking about them, maybe you're just dismissing them. So it's these kind of photos that really led me to a new interpretation.
Great. Let's go to the next one. What do we got?
Sure. So these are from the earliest chapter in the book. And I'm a labor historian, and I'm very interested in how workers came out of World War II in Chicago and tried to protest for economic justice, for racial justice. The picture on your left is a strike at the South Torrance Ford plant in 1955. And the picture on your right is Art Shay wandering around the South Side in the late 40s and early 50s. The picture on the right is quite remarkable in that I think it's Shay trying to show depression-like conditions despite the supposed era of prosperity that came in the 1950s. But also look at the people, right? They're all dressed in their Sunday best. They have, white sheets out on the line. The idea here is you're not supposed to pity these people. You're supposed to protest their terrible conditions, right? But they are rising above their circumstances, right? And showing their humanity. And so there's a lot of working class history in this book. And as the labor movement sort of makes a trade-off in some ways for job security and sort of guaranteed raises, they start to fall out of the social protest picture. But what I've discovered is that many working class people participated in these protest movements, just not officially through unions going into the 50s and 60s in Chicago.
Yeah, this is striking because housing was a major crisis in Chicago in the late 40s and early 50s, particularly in the African American community, because of boundaries around the Black Belt meant that there wasn't a working housing market. People had income, but there was no housing available except at much higher prices. And so these conditions of houses from the mid 1870s are still being used by large numbers of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Beryl Satter and other historians have really gone into the wealth extraction that went on, not just on the South Side, but also the book features a lot of West Side pictures. Yep. And the West Side of Chicago is really important. It develops later as a huge African-American part of Chicago. But the conditions there are in some ways even more challenging in terms of landlords in tandem with politicians and business people in that neighborhood, all conspiring against the residents who live there. So here is a sort of urban history photo. I think before this project, I considered myself an urban historian, but what I really did was history that took place in cities. Whereas now I have a very keen eye for urban space and how urban space is used by democratic protesters, but how urban space is also contained and used in different ways too. On the left, you see McCarthy giving a speech at the Palmer House Hotel in 1954, and then a number of protesters outside. And I love that sign out front, "Don't jump on McCarthy, jump on McCarthyism," something probably we can all relate to in our current moment. you know, the Palmer House Hotel was a contained space that only loyal people who donated, you know, to the Irish American Fund or whatever the sponsoring organization was could attend. And they were, you know, polite and civil, whereas outside you see a lot of working class people picketing on the street and making sure to confront this kind of, you know, the limiting of free speech, et cetera, that's narrowing protest politics in Chicago as well as elsewhere.
So that's Joe McCarthy on the left.
Right.
And I assume Art Shay is playing a little bit with the lights, and it's kind of like there's this halo, you know, of course, but
yes.
It's not a, but, and then he takes the pictures of the protests, and there's some subtle playing there, isn't there?
That's right. What's
Not so
amazing
subtle.
about Art Shay is how he has a sense of humor that's
Whoops, Eric, you're a little frozen there, but I think now you're back.
Did you lose me there for a second? Oh, sorry
Yeah,
about that.
that's all right.
I was just saying, someone else suggested recently that this wasn't just a halo, but maybe it was a dunce cap.
Yeah.
But, you know, whatever the case, Art Shay had a great sense of humor in the way he framed his photographs, trying to point out subtle things about people or about movements and the hypocrisy about, you know, of life, you know.
Yeah.
And here's a photo from the late part of the book. And, you know, this is also a book largely about social protest movements and how they develop. And the great part of this book was how I could see these protest movements in tandem with each other because of Art Shay's photography. So, you know, these different movements were interacting. And in this case, you see gangs that are allied with people like Paul King, who's a construction manager, and other African-American activists in the city of Chicago in 1969. And that's the UIC, the construction of the expansion of the UIC campus. And what they're doing there is shutting down construction sites to protest the fact that there's no affirmative action, and the construction trades have been practicing all white policies for decades in Chicago.
Yeah, and Art's using a fisheye lens of some sort, you know, that's
right.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
It's a fisheye lens that sort of captures the larger, sort of wider scene of all of this activity going on. I love all of the movement, you know, the Black Power fist in the background, all of the different expressions on these activist faces who are in coalition with each other.
Yeah, I should say at this point, you know, you mentioned very early on that you worked with Mike Ensdorf at Roosevelt University, who's a professor of photography. And I had the good pleasure of working with him as well in 2005. And I had the same change of experience around how do you look at photographs. He taught me how to look at them in a way I had not really known. As a historian, we're often in the documents and in the text. And these visuals as evidence are really, really compelling. And it was formative in my own work as well. So this is great. Sorry.
Yeah, Mike was such a key mentor and just gently showing me how to look at photographs, how to analyze photography, as well as a couple of practicing photographers, one who used to work for the Boston Globe, and another one who's actually a practicing photographer in Chicago. So absolutely, you know, I had to retrain myself to think about photography, and then take it a step further to think about photography and how do you analyze it historically.
Yeah. So who's here?
So this is the suburban chapter in the book. I didn't want to leave the suburbs out because, of course, the suburbs have such a huge impact on the city and vice versa in these years. And you know, Art Shay didn't really get involved in a lot of the protest movements he witnessed. But in this case, he did get personally involved because he moved to Deerfield just before this 1959 controversy broke out. And the controversy was a really basic thing, that some developers had tried to develop a high-end apartment complex that would have maybe a dozen wealthier African-American families move in. And as a result of that, the news leaking out, you get this meeting in November of 1959 in the elementary school gymnasium where the whole town shows up. And these two pictures that I picked from this chapter, one on the left is unbelievable, that this gentleman spoke out against the integration of the project and in favor of rezoning where the project site as a public park, which was a civil and polite way to get out of actually desegregating Deerfield. And his name was Jim Crow. He spelled his last name Crowe, but it was just an incredible story that, something that if it was fiction, you wouldn't believe it. And then on the other side, you see all of the residents of Deerfield, or many of them, raising their hands in support of blocking this project from happening in Deerfield. Mm. So, this really speaks well to like, other controversies like Trumbull Park, where you saw violence break out. Very little violence broke out in Deerfield, but it had the same result. And, it allowed for this level of housing inequality to exist and persist in Chicago and in the suburbs.
Eric, I'm really enjoying this so much that I've lost a little track of time. We're going to want to pick up the pace a little bit, but there was a question about whether Art Shay worked with other photographers in Chicago. Did he know people like Wayne Miller or even Vivian Mayer, who was pretty reclusive, or someone like Helen Balfour Morrison or others like that?
He did not know Vivian Mayer, but he had a lot to say about Vivian Mayer once she became famous in the later years of his life, once Vivian Mayer became discovered. And we had a lot of debates about her photography. He did know a lot of the life photographers. So he did know Wayne Miller, and there's another life photographer I'm forgetting who Art said drank too much, but showed him the ropes. And before Art actually worked for himself in Chicago, he was working for Life magazine, not as a photographer, but as a reporter. And so what this allowed for him to do is he got sent along with all of the great Life photographers in 1945, 1946, just after the war. And he said it was the greatest education in photography ever, because he would accompany these photographers on these shoots and then grill them about everything from the technical aspects of photography to the aesthetics. And so he got this amazing training as a photographer from all of the great Life photographers that had, participated in photographing the war and, et cetera, where some of the great, some of them were, of course, in the FSA project of the New Deal as well.
Let's keep rolling.
Okay. So protest politics. The book uses Art's photographs to look differently at the trajectory of protest politics in Chicago. So on your left here, you have a very early photograph of the Woodlawn organization. And in the middle of that photograph is Saul Alinsky, who of course is the famous community organizer from the previous decade. And this is a really interesting story about how Alinsky's people, got together with people in the Woodlawn neighborhood like Reverend Arthur Brazier and formed this really pain in the ass community organizing group that would do everything from rent strikes to, marching on slumlords to, going downtown and embarrassing the Daley administration to engaging in the war on poverty debate. So that's one model of organizing. And then the other side, you see here, a huge civil rights march in July 1963 in Chicago, and Mayor Daley is actually leading this march, which is quite interesting. And so the book tries to point out that this is a key turning point where you get Myrlie Evers is at this march, and she's one of the celebrities that's there. But you can see this photo that Art took of her. She's looking anything but celebratory, right? So the other people, officials in the march were trying to use civil rights as kind of a celebration, that civil rights only exists in the South as a problem, et cetera. Whereas Myrlie Evers is saying something different with her eyes there. And in fact, her husband, Medgar Evers, had just been murdered a couple months before this event. And then you see at that same march, a number of African Americans breaking out against this kind of Northern liberalism and suggesting that Chicago has a huge civil rights problem. All of these signs, and then a group rushes the stage and boos Daley off of the podium. And this is a key turning point where Chicago develops its own civil rights movement. And these different movements by 1966 come together in a really interesting way, where you have protesters against the Vietnam War, you have protesters against Chicago slums, you have all different kinds of movements coming together on a grassroots level. And I think this is a great photo because it's Lyndon Johnson's visiting Chicago, and these are some of the protesters who turned up to basically protest his visit. Whereas just a couple of years before, Johnson was being celebrated by Daley and by others in Chicago as the architect of the Civil Rights Act, as the architect of the war on poverty. But here, Chicagoans are coming out against him because of the war, as well as because of the shortcomings of his policies. And the book also covers politics, and machine politics in particular. And so I wanted to include at least one picture of Mayor Richard Daley. And this is a really interesting picture. This is 1963, and he's at the funeral of an alderman on the West Side named Ben Lewis, who had just been assassinated after winning re-election. And so Ben Lewis was the first Black alderman from that part of the West Side. And he clearly had crossed some machine boundary, some mafia boundary. This case remains unsolved. And here's Daley, Shay capturing Daley, looking at this woman rushing up the aisle in a fur coat. That was Ben Lewis's widow. And so the stakes were really high in terms of repression as well. And so the book is not just about democratic protest on the streets, it's also about the escalating repression of that protest. So just a couple of other quick photos before your next question.
Yeah.
This book also tries to take into account cultural history. And so there's a lot of musicians in the book, there are artists, there's actors that are involved. Of course, Dick Gregory was central to the Chicago Freedom Movement in many ways, and people really need to know that. This photo, though, is really just outstanding because I think it says the sort of, Shay is capturing Muhammad Ali here.
Yeah, he's over here in the corner, left side.
That's right, on the left side. And rather than capturing him in the boxing ring or capturing a frame, framing him as the center of attention, he's framing Muhammad Ali as part of the Nation of Islam, which is really interesting. And this moment where he captured Muhammad Ali, I think was early 1967. And this is right around when Muhammad Ali is coming out against the Vietnam War in a dramatic way and really ramping up the anti-war movement and, signifying the interracial nature of the anti-war movement in Chicago too, that it wasn't just students at University of Chicago, but it was working class people who very much came out against the war early on as well.
We got about 5 minutes before we'd like to go to some Q&A, Eric. Sorry to run the...
Oh, not at all, no. So I also included a couple of so this is the counter protest, and in this case, it's manufactured counter protest. And I think this is interesting in relation to today. You get the Democratic machine in Chicago setting up all of this support for Lyndon Johnson when he comes in 1966 to try to drown out the protesters, right? And to try to suggest that ordinary people in Chicago feel strongly for Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party. But Shay was very careful to not only capture them with their matching signs, but to also capture the fact that Streets and Sanitation was being paid to unload the signs. And no doubt many people that were holding those signs were probably loyal machine workers in the city government, right? So it's kind of an early example of astroturfing or sort of paid protesters to sort of generate a kind of support for the status quo. And then there's another level of repression in the book too. And I really have to thank Melanie Newport, who's writing this fantastic history of Cook County Jail that's coming out soon. She pointed me in the direction of these papers at the Chicago History Museum of Hans Modek, who is a criminologist, but also worked in the Cook County Jail. And that led me down to do more research on juvenile delinquency in the 50s, right? So why was there a lack of troublemaking? Well, part of it was the Cold War, and part of it was, the sort of prosperity of that era. But another huge part of it, I argue in the book, was the policing of urban space, and that teenagers, which was kind of a new term in the 1950s, in certain neighborhoods were put in juvenile detention facilities for doing things like playing pool. Again, Art Shay here with the great sense of humor. This young man is in front of a men's room sign, right, saying men, and he's clearly a boy. And then discovering Art Shay's photos of a downstate juvenile facility in Sheridan, Illinois, that was a huge scandal in the late 1950s for putting young men in these solitary confinement cells for weeks on end, naked, for beating these kids. This facility was overcrowded as well as other facilities. And so the book looks at this sort of escalation of police tactics, how those tactics become more and more racialized. And of course, Simon Balto's recent book on the Chicago Police Department and conversations with him were key on this too, to try to understand the level of repression of democratic protest on the streets of Chicago, and how many man hours and how many taxpayer dollars were spent to support the Chicago Red Squad, the Chicago Gang Intelligence Unit, to fill the Cook County Jail, to fill downstate facilities as well with people that were deemed, disposable, basically, not worthy. And Shay was able to amazingly talk his way into all these places, probably, selling them on, I'm interested in looking at what reforms you've done to make this place more hospitable, or bribing the guard, or, other things to get this access that would be really difficult to get to today.
Yeah, so he's got a real interest in youth politics.
And this is a photograph of something I didn't think actually was documented, which is a really important moment in Chicago, which is the Division Street riots of 1966, where Puerto Ricans in the neighborhood were protesting against police brutality. And then the police just started rounding up everyone in the neighborhood who was young and male. And Shay got access to the local precinct. He's taking pictures of these kids that are getting rounded up and abused and harassed, and the police brutality in this neighborhood was really important. And it had a great impact, actually, on a lot of other activism going around in Chicago in 1966. Less so for the sort of more famous Chicago freedom movement led by Martin Luther King, and more so by those people I showed earlier who were involved in the anti-war movement, as well as fighting for economic and social justice.
So was Shay in the middle of the freedom movement moment in 1966 in Chicago?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he documented it, and here are a couple of pictures from the more famous Chicago freedom movement. And
oh yeah.
On the left here, you see a sit-in and a pray-in in front of a real estate office in August of 1966. And if you look real closely, you can see Jesse Jackson there kneeling. And just in front of him with the yarmulke is James Bevel, another key, civil rights leader in Chicago. On the right, you see, to me, the banality of evil. There are pictures in the book, and there are pictures Shay took of young people with swastikas who were, ruffians. But this picture kind of frightened me almost more. This young woman, dressed up, passing out newspapers, who looks innocent enough. And this, by the way, is in the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. And yet, if you look really closely, she's wearing a swastika pin, and she's passing out white supremacist newspapers to—
right on her neck, right?
Yeah,
right near her neck.
Right.
It's hard to see, but
yeah, you gotta look for those subtle details there. So the book argues that actually it's the late 1960s that's the peak of this protest activity. It's after King and his allies left Chicago that a lot of protest activity emerged in the Black Power movement and in the anti-war movement. Of course, Shay took amazing pictures that a lot of other photographers didn't get of the famous 1968 Democratic National Convention. I picked this picture out because it features Dick Gregory in the center, who is a key leader, perhaps much more important than King in terms of thinking about civil rights in Chicago. And then there's Allen Ginsberg putting a flower in his pocket. And then if you look in the background, there's Bobby Seale, the national leader of the Black Panthers, looking on.
With the hat or with the?
With the, he's got the sort of red shirt.
Orangish shirt? Okay.
Orangish shirt, right. Mm-hmm. And of course, Shay also documented the police riot of the 1968 DNC. And so I used his photographs to try to tell a slightly different story of that infamous event, and also tried to put it in perspective that in many ways what happened after the DNC in terms of the Black Power movement and the level of repression was a much bigger challenge and a much more violent one in terms of police repression than the DNC, where a lot of kids got beat up, but no one died. You know, a lot of it was optics for the camera. There were even stories of police, you know, arresting people, putting them in paddy wagons, and then taking them a few blocks away and letting them go. You know, people weren't being tortured in police custody like what happens here. And this last photo, in terms of my sample slides for this, is inside the Black Panthers headquarters in 1969. Not the infamous raid where Fred Hampton was assassinated, but earlier that summer where they broke in and burned up all the breakfast and, you know, tried to destroy their programs basically. And here's Shay taking a photograph the next day of, you know, young women, children, and others on the West Side trying to pick up the pieces and continue in their fight for economic justice and against what they saw was fascism in the city of Chicago.
We have a few questions from the audience for you, Erik. One is, where would someone find these photographs? Is the archive available? It's
not fully public yet, but so Art Shay died 3 years ago, and since then, Erica de Galloper, his assistant, has become maintained his archive, and she's done amazing things in sort of organizing it, and she's in discussions with a number of different public groups. And her goal, which is my goal too, is to make sure that this archive stays accessible to the public and gets more accessible to the public rather than get sold off to private dealers, et cetera. And there is a gallery in downtown Chicago that features a lot of Art Shay's work where people can buy prints from his negatives. But the entire archive is definitely, it's looking like it's going to end up somewhere where the public can access it, hopefully somewhere in Chicago.
And was there good, what we call metadata, descriptions and dates and things attached to each photo, or sometimes yes, sometimes
not always, but you know, what's remarkable is that Erica has gone back and looked through old transmittal sort of data to Life magazine, to other publications, and has put spreadsheets together and all kinds of things to sort of date and put context to these photos. And so, you know, in my digging through these photos, I was able to give a lot of context to photos that otherwise wouldn't have had that context as well.
We had a question about the your moment, the coalition that was intended to integrate the construction industry, and you'd mentioned that, and somebody wanted you to talk a little further. I know you've done a lot of work on that moment in the late 1960s when that possibility existed. Is that something Art Shay knows a lot about, or can you give us that in 60 seconds?
Sure. I mean, this is something that I think every Chicagoan should know about in terms of thinking of social protest in Chicago, which is that, you know, a huge coalition of more than 50 groups, church groups, civil rights groups, other civic groups, gangs got together in '68 and formed the Coalition for United Community Action, or KUCA. And it was one of the most powerful protest movements to ever emerge in Chicago. And it really challenged the institutional racism of the construction industry, but also that of the Daley administration. I think this movement frightened Daley and his hold on power over the democratic machine more so perhaps than even the earlier Chicago freedom movement led by King. And what they were demanding is economic justice. They wanted to get young men, in particular, and the unemployment rate among young Black men in 1969 was skyrocketing, into good jobs. And the federal government came in and weighed in, and they agreed that this coalition was legit. And it's interesting that the gangs were some of the most disciplined members of the coalition. That UIC protest picture that I showed earlier, that had a lot of gang members in it. And it was actually Jesse Jackson who showed up and caused a ruckus, rather than the sort of disciplined gang members who showed up in their berets and sort of marched in military formation.
So there was a question about that photo, about whether whether Shay understood that there were police who attended the UIC protest meetings, and perhaps undercover, and that was part of perhaps the Red Squad story, that of police infiltrating and creating their own trouble, being troublemakers in a different way.
Right. And, exactly. The title Troublemakers, one side is always accusing the other in the historical documents of being troublemakers, right? But who are the real troublemakers, right? In 1969, was it gang members, or was it the police who were murdering people like Fred Hampton? The gang intelligence unit started in the mid 1960s with just a few officers, and it expanded exponentially by the late 1960s, to the point where there was a terrorist court in the city of Chicago that was trying to railroad young men, in particular, who were involved in any kind of gang activity, and especially the people who were involved in gang activity who were connected to civil rights stuff, into jail, right? And so, this is a key hinge of Chicago history. It helps explain the police brutality that continues and becomes so entrenched, but it also helps explain, the history of gangs and why Chicago, since then, has had so many violent gangs, right? Here's an opportunity where many of these gangs were allied in a constructive movement to try to get jobs. And, it was only when they were treated like thugs and criminals that they started acting like thugs and criminals again.
Yeah, so that's a story that really needs to be told. We had a different question in a different direction. Art Shay appears to always be in the right place at the right time in some ways in this story. He's there, he's able to capture these moments. How is he so good at being what one of our audience members calls omnipresent?
Yeah, I often talk about Art Shay as being like the Z-Lig, that Woody Allen movie, where he just always happens to be in the right place at the right time. Or for the younger people, the Forrest Gump, although he's not Forrest Gump in that he's intentionally there, and he has this intelligence about where to find protest and where to find significant action in the city. And I think, again, that just goes back to his training and the fact that he worked for himself. And so many days he was trying to find a story, but other days he, was wandering around the city in neighborhoods where white people didn't wander, and taking photographs there. So, it's remarkable. He didn't capture everything that I would say is significant to these years, but certainly so much of it. And it's just unbelievable the way he got around the city. Whereas other photographers who worked for Life magazine, would be sent into downtown to just get the one shot of something. Art was doing something entirely different. And that's what allowed this project to happen. And I hope other people can get a chance to appreciate his just amazing photographic sense as an artist and a photojournalist.